I'm Greg Collins. I'm the Chief Learning Scientist for NIT. Today I'm going to talk about bad ideas. In particular, I'm going to look at 4 ideas that are extremely popular in education, but that I think are taking us in the wrong direction. The first idea I want to look at is learning styles. Now, if you've had anything to do with education in the last 20 years, you almost certainly have been exposed to this idea. But for the record, the concept is that everyone learns differently, and that we can express those differences as different input modalities. So, for example, some people learn better by looking at pictures, some people learn better verbally, some people learn better, as the learning styles theory has it, kinesthetically, that is by doing things that involve movement. Some people learn better through math and other formal systems and so on and so forth. So there are several different versions of this, but roughly they all have in common that there's a verbal learning style, there's a visual learning style, and usually there's a kinesthetic learning style. So before I look at why this is a bad idea, let me talk a little bit about what's made it so popular. So the first thing that's made it popular is that it's probably in the running for the most intuitively plausible idea there is in education. In fact, somebody did a survey some years ago where they asked different people involved in education which theories and concepts they most believed in. And learning styles won going away. Almost nobody doesn't believe in the idea. It's also sort of satisfyingly sciencey. It has a sort of pedigree that goes back to Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory. And there's also something that's a little more, kind of emotional, but it's a fun theory to espouse. So nobody feels bad about standing up for individualism, right? So you're essentially saying everybody's different. By golly, we have to treat them differently. And of course, you feel like an idiot opposing that, sort of saying no, I think everybody should be treated the same. So it sort of feels like a theory you can't lose with. So what's wrong with it? Well, even before we get to this sort of empirical results testing it, there are a couple of things you can see that are a little bit wonky about it. The first is that once you get beyond the verbal and visual learning styles, things get a little weird. So, for example, I saw a learning activity that was done quite seriously. There was a mitosis dance. So the idea is you learn how DNA mitosis works by doing a dance where I guess you play the little DNA bases. That gets a little strange, if you think about how you would teach musically quantum mechanics, that would be a little odd. So you get into some odd territory that way. And the other thing is that, I noticed, I like everybody else, I believed this theory at first. I started noticing an odd thing, which is that everyone thinks they're a visual learner. So nobody says they're a verbal learner or a kinesthetic learner. We often sort of point to other people and classify them that way. But we all think we're visual. It's sort of the Gryffindor of learning styles. It's sort of the only thing that anybody actually identifies with. So, but the important issue is that people have gone out, and this being a popular theory, and done actual experiments in which they've roughly separated learners into cohorts and had some of those cohorts learn in one style, some of them learn in another style, and so on. And of course, the idea of learning styles is correct. The idea is that if you learn in your style, you'll learn better. If you learn in another style, you'll learn worse. Well, experiment after experiment has failed to find that. And that's even worse than it sounds because the people doing the experiments were mostly people who espoused this theory. So they were essentially trying to prove a theory that they believed in, and they still failed. And this failure is definitive. It's across the board. There have been tons of meta-studies. Lots of people have written about this, but Daniel Willingham at University of Virginia has probably documented it most convincingly. The theory doesn't work. It's just failed. It's dead and buried. The APA has endorsed this negative finding. Even Howard Gardner, whose theories underlie it, has basically accepted this. So it's done. It's time to give up. It's time to stop putting slides into our instructional design decks talking about learning styles. Leave it alone. The only thing that's left is to say, well, why? Why in the world wouldn't such a plausible idea work? And there's several explanations. The best explanation in my mind is this, that what really matters is not the match between the input and the learner. What matters is the match between the input and the content. So if you're teaching Renaissance painting, it makes sense that it's going to be visual, right? If you're teaching romantic poetry, it makes sense that it's verbal. If you're teaching quantum mechanics, it makes sense that it's mathematical. And that matters much, much more. It swamps whatever effect there is of individuals liking different styles better. All right, second point, attention span. So you may have seen some articles sort of like this. They sort of reached a sort of climax in the media about 2 or 3 years ago, talking about how short people's attention spans have gotten. And the articles will say something like, well, people's attention spans used to be 15 seconds long, but now they're down to 8, right? And one of the popular memes sort of had it that our attention span is now proven to be shorter than a goldfish. So what makes that popular? Well, I think there are a couple things. One, it's very satisfyingly sciencey. It sounds like something somebody went in and measured. You can just imagine sticking probes in people's heads and really accurately measuring that attention span. So that feels good. It's been a flavor of the month because it fits into a broader narrative. There's a whole societal narrative about how we're being bombarded with information, and millennials are coming up who can't pay attention to anything because they grew up with computers and so on. So it fits a narrative that's kind of out there in general. It's kind of a flavor of the month concept. And it also has, especially for learning designers, it has a nice property of allowing you to blame the victim. So for example, if I design a piece of learning and you're bored with it, there are two conclusions we can reach about that. One is I designed a lousy piece of learning. The other is you don't have the attention span of a goldfish, so what do we expect? And obviously the latter is a happier outcome for me. Well, so what's wrong with this? Well, first of all, it's absolutely not the case that attention span is a well-defined scientific concept. Nobody who does research, in neurobiology has a definition of this that they're going out and measuring. There aren't any electrodes. This is a very general, sloppy concept that we're applying here. And furthermore, it makes no sense intuitively. If you think about this for a second, if you think about the evolution of human attention, it just doesn't make sense that it would suddenly shift after some arbitrary amount of time goes by. I mean, imagine you're in the primeval forest and you're escaping from a saber-toothed tiger or something. And 15 seconds are up and suddenly you forget what you're doing and you say, oh, look at that cloud. It looks like a turtle. That would not be, I'm not a sociobiologist, but that's not a very good evolutionary story. That doesn't make any sense. Attention stays on things as long as it needs to for the most part. And furthermore, if you think about your own experience in the modern day, this is an obvious slander, right? I mean, people spend much more attention than 8 seconds on all kinds of things. People watch movies and manage to pay attention. People binge watch TV shows these days. People stay up all night playing video games, et cetera, et cetera. There are plenty of instances of people attending to things for hours and even longer than that. So it's clearly wrong, just based on our own simple experience. And, I don't know enough to know this, but I suspect goldfish are being slandered here as well. I don't think that they have a 10-second attention span. I bet if there's a barracuda or something lurking nearby, they can focus long enough to do what they have to do. So, as often happens in these cases, what's happened is mainstream media have gotten a reference from a sort of non-mainstream media source, and they've all referenced each other, so it sounds like a really solid idea. We look at people, out there who've endorsed this idea in their articles. It looks like it's got to be believable. BBC 4 Radio's More or Less show, which is terrific, by the way, who make a living sort of debunking statistical fallacies, went out and checked this down to the source, and it turns out that there was a website called Statistic Brain, which cited something called the National Center for Biotechnology, who, when BBC contacted them, said they had never done any research like this, had no idea where it came from. So it's a spurious piece of research. And the important thing about it is, I think whenever you hear somebody citing this fact in an educational context, the most obvious conclusion to draw is here's someone who makes a lot of boring content and wants a way to excuse that. Third point I'm going to talk about is awareness. I mean awareness as in awareness training. So awareness training is something that probably most large corporate entities invest a lot in these days. It's sort of typically something like half-hour, 45-minute training module that's just meant to give you an introduction to something. And usually the idea is that you're at the bottom rung of some kind of ladder like this, awareness, then knowledge, then skill, then practice, something like that, a sort of quasi-theory of how you learn the stages. And this is the first stage, and that's all we're going to do. So why is this? Well, I think this is accepted for two reasons. One is people in learning get asked to build lots of learning. And sometimes it's easier to build, a little half-hour module with some simple explanations in it than it is to tell people that their learning, the learning they want to build is not a priority and we don't have time for it. So I think it's sort of an organizational path of least resistance. More importantly, in a weird way, it's a license for people who know better, pedagogically speaking, to misbehave. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So the key point here is that the point of training is to teach somebody to do something better. That's it. That's what it means to train. That's what it means to learn. To learn means to learn to do something better than you could do it before. So awareness in that context is a weird concept. It's almost a perverse sort of limiting concept. Like if you accidentally screwed up and taught somebody to do the skill that you're talking about, you'd have gone too far. You failed, right? I mean, in order to do awareness training, you have to not succeed in teaching people the skill or to even have a deep understanding. You just have to gloss over the surface. And that raises a number of questions. I mean, they're sort of obvious. I mean, one is like, how would you know when you've done this? Right? I mean, what's the sign that awareness has been achieved? Another point about it is that there's no real science here. I mean, there's no science behind these little ladders, these stages. There's nothing that says that trying to get to awareness as a stage in learning before you get to mastery of a skill is a good way to go. There's nothing supporting that whatsoever. So it really seems to be, awareness seems to be a kind of safe word that people in training and education use when somebody's getting a little bit too serious about teaching something. So, if you get a little too into sort of trying to teach the skill, somebody says, calm down, this is just awareness. You don't have to work that hard. So this is a bad idea. It wastes energy. It creates bad training for learners. Figure out what it is you want people to do and teach that. And if you don't want people to do anything, don't teach. Okay, last idea is something called 70-20-10. This is really big in corporate education. I'm not so much in sort of K through 12 and so on. But the basic idea of 70-20-10, contra to this slide, which says it's not as simple as it sounds, is actually quite simple. The idea is that if you look at how a typical organization works, 70% of what people know about how to do their jobs, they learn on the job. And 20% they learn somehow by communicating with people, like maybe talking to their boss. And 10% they learn from formal training. Okay, so that's the idea. And this idea sort of took the corporate education world by storm. So certainly it was a flavor of the month. It was a sort of a popular idea. That's fading now, but it's still around. It has a sciencey feel. The original paper talks about going out and doing a field study, and that's what it's based on. But I think the real appeal of 70-20-10 is it's sort of pseudo-apocalyptic. And what I mean by that is the people who espoused 70-20-10 sort of came along and used it as a way to say, everything you think you know about education training is wrong. We're doing it all wrong. It doesn't happen in the classroom. It's not the formal training that matters. It's the stuff in the field that matters. We have to turn everything upside down. So it's always sort of tempting. It's always appealing to have that kind of apocalyptic notion because it gives you a reason to come in and say, okay, we're gonna do a bunch of new stuff. So the case against this, well, Lombardo and Eichinger's original study, first of all, it concerned one case, like literally one. It lacked verified data, or at least, I mean, maybe that's a little harsh, but no one else other than the original authors actually saw the data from this. And furthermore, the data, even as they described it, was based on the reflections of participants. In other words, they didn't watch to see how people learned. They asked people how they learned. They just sat someone down and said, how much of your knowledge of the job do you think you got on the job? And that person said, I don't know, 70, something like that. And that's what they wrote down. So the data is just the theory of the people they were looking at, not based on any observation. And last thing, I don't want to make too big a fuss about this, but in weirdly round numbers. When I do experiments, they don't usually come out in some tidy way like 70-20-10, right? So that's a little odd. The next point about it is that it's even simpler than it looks in the first place. Nobody talks about the 20. All the conversation around this is about the 70 and the 10. The 20 is kind of a fifth wheel. The 70 is The 70 is what people learn in the job. The 10 is what people learn in formal training. And the point seems to be that, wow, people learn a lot more in the job than they learn in formal training. Well, if you stop and think about it, did anybody not think that? I mean, did we really think that people learn much more in their formal training they get at the start of a job usually than they learn in the whole process of actually doing the job? So it's not clear what the surprise is here. It's also, one of the weird things about the way this is applied is even if you take it at face value, this is just an observation. This just says we went somewhere and we looked at how much of people's learning was based on what kind of input, and we reported back. That doesn't say it should be like that. There's no evidence that this is the best way to do it or that this organization is a paragon. So, it's just an observation, and if it's true, so what? What's the problem? What's the framework that says there's anything wrong with that? Why shouldn't it be the case, if it is the case, that we learn 70% of what we learn in the job? What's wrong with that? So it's not even clear what action this should push us to. And nonetheless, this idea is, as I said, is used as a kind of apocalyptic notion that everything has to change. And now, how is it supposed to change? Well, a good idea for how to change based on this might be to say, maybe we should make the 10%, the formal training, look more like what happens on the job. It seems like people learn pretty effectively on their own when they're actually doing a job. Maybe we should take some lessons from that. That actually might be a good outcome. Unfortunately, what's happened is essentially the exact opposite of that. So training organizations, and maybe this is predictable in some organizational dynamic sense, look at this and what they say is, gosh, we've been focusing all our attention and making that 10%. That's been our job, make the formal training, make the 10%. We should be making whatever it is that happens in the 70%. So it becomes a license for training organizations to get their hands all over what's happening to people on the job on the theory that they're now going to make that work better. But what reason is there to think it's working wrong in the first place? I mean, the original datum was that people learn much more that way than any other way. So it's sort of an odd, almost backwards justification for an intervention that nobody's asking for. Okay, so that's it. So that's 4 ideas that I think are taking education in the wrong direction that we should forget about and move on. Thank you.